The security footage doesn't lie, but I still can't explain what I saw. My name is Carla, and I've been an embalmer at Riverside Mortuary for 11 years. I work the night shift because the pay is better, and because I prefer the quiet. No grieving families, no phone calls, no interruptions. Just me, the prep room, and the steady hum of the refrigeration units. I've always found comfort in routine, the same procedures, the same motions, the careful restoration of dignity to the deceased. It's solitary work, but it suits me. That Tuesday started like any other. I clocked in at 10 p.m., checked the intake log, and began my rounds. We had 3 bodies in cold storage, all scheduled for services later in the week. I restocked my supplies, arterial fluid, cavity fluid, suture thread, and noticed that several bottles had been moved from their usual spots. Not a big deal. Maybe the day shift had been disorganized. I rearranged everything according to my system and got to work. Around midnight, I took my break in the staff room. When I returned to the prep area, I noticed it again. The bottle of formaldehyde I'd placed on the left side of the counter was now on the right. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to remember if I'd moved it myself. Sometimes muscle memory plays tricks. I shrugged it off and continued working. But then, it happened again at 2 a.m. This time, it was unmistakable. I'd arranged 6 bottles in a specific order. I even took a photo on my phone to prove I wasn't losing my mind. When I came back from disposing of waste, they'd been rearranged, not knocked over, not disturbed, just methodically repositioned in a different sequence. That's when I checked the security cameras. We have 3 cameras in the mortuary, 1 covering the entrance, 1 in the main corridor, and 1 aimed at the cold storage area. I pulled up the footage from that night and scrubbed through it, looking for any sign of someone entering the building. Nothing. I was the only person there. But then I switched to the cold storage feed and my hands went cold. At 12:47 a.m., while I was in the staff room, one of the body bags moved. Not dramatically, not like in the movies. It was subtle, a slow shift from one position to another, maybe 6 inches to the left. The bag was sealed, the zipper facing upward, completely undisturbed. But over the course of 3 minutes, frame by frame, it slid across the stainless steel table, as if something inside was redistributing weight. I watched it 3 times, 4 times. I measured the timestamps, 12:47 to 12:50, 3 full minutes of gradual, impossible movement. The bag belonged to Richard Kemper, 72 years old, died of congestive heart failure. I'd received him that morning. Standard intake. No trauma, no complications. He'd been in cold storage for 14 hours, and bodies don't move after rigor mortis sets in. They especially don't move while sealed in a bag, on a flat surface, with no external force applied. I sat in that office for 20 minutes, staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, a trick of the camera, a glitch in the recording, something rational. But I've worked with these cameras for years. They don't glitch. They don't lie. I went back to the cold storage unit. The door was heavy, reinforced, and it sealed with a pressurized hiss. Inside, the temperature hovered at 38 degrees. 3 bodies lay on their respective tables, each in their labeled bag. Richard Kemper was in the middle. His bag was exactly where I'd left it that morning. No signs of disturbance. The zipper was still positioned correctly, the tag hanging off the side, his name written in my own handwriting. I stood there in the cold, listening to the hum of the refrigeration unit, and felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I didn't open the bag. I'm not sure why. Professional protocol, maybe. Or maybe I didn't want to see if something inside had changed. Instead, I returned to the office and kept watching the footage. I scrubbed forward, past my break, past the moment I'd returned to the prep room. At 2:17 a.m., while I was working at the embalming table with my back turned, the bag moved again. This time, it shifted toward the edge of the table, just slightly, as if testing the boundary. I looked at the timestamp on my computer. It was 2:53 a.m. I walked back to cold storage. My hand hesitated on the door handle, and I realized I was holding my breath. When I opened it, the cold air spilled out, and I stepped inside. Richard Kemper's bag had moved to the very edge of the table. Not far enough to fall, but close. The zipper was still sealed. The tag still hung in place. But the position was different. Unmistakably, undeniably different. I should have called someone. My supervisor, maybe, or the night guard from the funeral home across town. But who would believe me? Instead, I stood there, staring at the bag, watching for any sign of movement. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and then, very faintly, I heard it. A sound like fabric sliding against metal. Slow, deliberate. I turned and left the room. I locked the door behind me. I returned to the prep area, finished the work I had scheduled, and avoided looking at the security monitor for the rest of the shift. When my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I gave her the intake report and left without mentioning anything. But I made a copy of the footage. I've watched it maybe a dozen times since then. I've shown it to no one. Richard Kemper was buried 4 days later. The service was quiet, attended by his daughter and a few cousins. I didn't work the funeral, but I heard it went smoothly. No complications, no disturbances. I still work the night shift. I still check the cameras. And every time I walk past cold storage, I listen for the sound of something shifting in the dark. Sealed away, but not quite still. The footage doesn't lie. But I've stopped trying to explain it. Some things I've learned don't want to be explained. I found a grave that shouldn't exist. My name is Vincent, and I've been a groundskeeper at Maplewood Cemetery for 23 years. It's steady work, mowing, trimming, repairing headstones, and occasionally digging graves when the backhoe operator is out. I know every plot, every section, every tree on these 57 acres. I know which graves sink after heavy rain and which families visit on Sundays. I know the cemetery better than I know my own neighborhood. So when I started digging adjacent to plot 14G and hit something that wasn't supposed to be there, I knew immediately that something was wrong. It was early October, a Thursday morning. The air was cool, the grass still wet with dew. I'd been assigned to dig a new grave in Section 14, Row G, Plot 2. The deceased was a woman named Margaret Halloway, 79, died peacefully in her sleep. Her family had purchased the plot 6 months earlier, right next to her late husband in Plot 14G1. I dug hundreds of graves. The process is methodical. Mark the dimensions, remove the sod, dig down 6 feet, keep the walls straight. It's physical work, but I've always found it meditative. There's a rhythm to it, a respect in the labor. I was about 4 feet down when my shovel hit something solid. Not dirt, not rock, wood. I stopped and crouched down, brushing away the soil with my gloved hand. It was a casket old, partially rotted, but unmistakable. The wood was dark, water-stained, and covered in a thin layer of clay. I could see the grain, the corner joints, even a tarnished metal handle, but it was in the wrong place. Plot 14G1, where Margaret's husband was buried, was to my left. I was digging plot 14G2, which according to every map and record we had, was empty. Virgin ground. Yet here I was, 4 feet down, staring at a casket that had no business being there. I climbed out of the grave and called my supervisor, Dale. He arrived 20 minutes later, looked into the hole, and went quiet. Dale's been at Maplewood longer than I have, 31 years, and I've never seen him rattled. But standing there, staring down at that casket, his face went pale. "You sure you're in the right plot?" he asked. I showed him the survey markers, the plot map, the measurements. Everything was exact. We were in plot 14G2. The casket below me was directly beneath where Margaret Halloway was supposed to be buried. Dale made some calls. Within an hour, we had the cemetery director on site, along with the county records clerk. They brought the original plot maps, ledgers dating back to 1946 when this section was opened, and every deed and sales record for Row G. According to the records, Plot 14G2 had been purchased in 1953 by a man named Arthur Wainwright. But Arthur Wainwright never died. Or more accurately, there was no death certificate, no burial record, no service log. The plot had been paid for in full, marked as sold, but never used. Maybe it's a mistake, the director said. Maybe someone was buried here off the books. But that didn't make sense. Cemeteries keep meticulous records. Every burial requires permits, certificates, legal documentation. You can't just bury someone in an empty plot without a paper trail. We decided to excavate carefully. It took the rest of the day. We brought in the backhoe, removed the soil layer by layer, and exposed the full casket. It was 6 feet down, positioned exactly where a burial should be. But there was no vault, no concrete liner, nothing. Just the casket, rotting in the earth. The wood had deteriorated badly. When we finally lifted it with straps, the sides began to crack. We transported it to the maintenance shed and set it on sawhorses under fluorescent lights. The cemetery director called the county coroner, and we waited. I didn't want to look inside, but I couldn't stop myself. The lid had warped over the decades, and there was a gap along the seam. I leaned closer, shining my flashlight through the opening, and saw fabric, deteriorated satin lining, stained brown with age. And then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw the bones, a skeleton, fully intact, lying in repose. The hands were folded across the chest. The skull faced upward, jaw slightly open. Whoever this person was, they'd been buried properly, with care. But there was something else. Resting on the ribcage, partially embedded in the rotted fabric, was a piece of paper. I reached in carefully and pulled it free. It was brittle, yellowed, but still legible. It was a bill of sale for Plot 14G2, dated March 9, 1953, purchased by Arthur Wainwright, and at the bottom, in faded handwriting, a single line, "For when I'm ready." The coroner arrived that evening and took possession of the remains. They ran every test they could: dental records, DNA, forensic analysis. The bones were consistent with a male in his 40s or 50s, buried sometime in the early 1950s. But there was no match, no missing persons report, no identity. Arthur Wainwright, according to public records, lived until 1972. He died in a nursing home in Pennsylvania and was buried there, 3 states away. So who was in his plot? We reburied the casket in an unmarked section reserved for unknown remains. Margaret Halloway was laid to rest in a different plot, 2 rows over. The family was never told about the delay or the reason for it. But I think about it constantly. I think about that handwriting, "For when I'm ready," and what it might mean. Did Arthur Wainwright bury someone else in his place? A stranger? A victim? Or did he bury something he wanted kept hidden, paid for a plot, and walk away? I still work Section 14. I mow around Plot 14G2 every week. The grass grows thick there now, undisturbed. But every time I pass it, I wonder, who was buried in that grave? And why did Arthur Wainwright purchase a plot for someone who didn't exist? The records say the plot is empty now, but I dug there. I saw the casket. And sometimes, late in the afternoon when the shadows grow long, I swear the ground above 14G looks sunken, as if the earth is still settling, as if something below is still waiting. Her hands kept changing position, and I was the only one in the room. My name is Naomi, and I've been a funeral director at Crestwood Memorial for 9 years. I've coordinated hundreds of services, prepared countless bodies, and comforted more grieving families than I can count. It's demanding work, emotionally and physically, but I've never questioned it. There's a dignity in helping people say goodbye, in creating a moment of peace amid grief. But what happened with Eleanor Pritchard changed something in me, something I can't quite name. Eleanor died at 86, peacefully, in her sleep. Her daughter, Caroline, arranged the service and requested an open casket viewing. Eleanor had been a schoolteacher for 40 years, beloved in her community, and Caroline wanted people to see her at rest, serene, the way she'd looked in life. I met Eleanor's body on a Tuesday morning. She'd been transported from the hospital, and I began the standard preparations: washing, setting features, dressing her in the navy blue dress Caroline had provided. Eleanor had kind eyes, deep set and gentle, and even in death, her face held a softness. I positioned her hands carefully, folded across her midsection, left over right, fingers interlaced. It's a traditional pose, peaceful and natural. I've done it thousands of times. I adjusted her collar, made sure the dress lay smoothly, and stepped back to evaluate. She looked dignified, restful. The viewing was scheduled for Thursday evening. I had 2 days to finalize everything. Wednesday morning, I returned to the viewing room to check on her. We keep the deceased in climate-controlled rooms between preparation and service, and I always make a final inspection the day before. When I entered, I immediately noticed something off. Eleanor's hands had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable. Her fingers were still interlaced, but now the right hand was on top instead of the left. I stood there, staring, trying to remember if I'd made a mistake the day before, but I knew I hadn't. Left over right, always. I adjusted them back, pressing gently to make sure they stayed in place. Rigor mortis had passed, and her limbs were pliable, but once positioned, they shouldn't move on their own. I made a note in my checklist and left. Thursday morning, I returned for a final inspection before the family arrived. The moment I walked in, I froze. Her hands had changed again. This time, her fingers weren't just interlaced, they were clasped tightly, as if gripping something invisible. The knuckles were slightly raised, the tendons visible beneath the skin. It looked deliberate, purposeful. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I checked the room door locked, no signs of entry, temperature stable. No one had been inside. I was the only person with a key. I repositioned her hands again, more carefully this time, and made sure everything else was perfect. The flowers were arranged, the lighting was soft, and the guest book was set up near the entrance. I told myself it was nothing. Bodies settle, muscles shift. It happens. But I didn't believe it. The viewing began at 6 p.m. Caroline arrived early with her husband and 2 sons. She approached the casket slowly, her face tightening with emotion, and then she smiled. "She looks beautiful," she whispered, "just like herself." I stood in the back of the room, monitoring as guests arrived. Old colleagues, former students, neighbors, they filed past the casket, some crying, some smiling, all paying their respects. Everything was going smoothly. And then, around 7 p.m., I noticed it again. I was standing near the doorway when I glanced at Eleanor's hands. They'd shifted. The fingers were no longer folded peacefully, they were spread slightly, as if reaching for something. I blinked, certain I was imagining it. But no, the position was different. I waited until the room cleared during a lull and walked to the casket. Up close, it was unmistakable. Her right hand had moved outward, the fingers extended, the palm facing upward. It looked like she was waiting for someone to take her hand. My heart was pounding. I adjusted her hands again, pressing them firmly into place, and stepped back. A few more guests entered, and I forced myself to smile, to greet them, to act normal. But I kept watching, and 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time, I saw it. Not the movement itself, but the result. I'd been looking away for maybe 30 seconds, speaking to an elderly woman near the guest book, and when I turned back, Eleanor's hands had shifted once more. Now they were folded differently, right over left, fingers loosely interlaced, the way someone might clasp their hands in prayer. I felt my throat tighten. I excused myself, walked quickly to the staff office, and sat down, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't possible. Bodies don't move like that, not without cause. Not with that kind of precision. I returned to the viewing room. Caroline was standing by the casket, her hand resting gently on her mother's folded hands. She didn't seem to notice anything unusual. No one did, except me. The viewing ended at 9 p.m. I escorted the last guests out, locked the doors, and returned to the room. Eleanor lay in the casket, her hands now folded left over right, the exact position I'd set them in 4 days ago. I stood there for a long time, staring at her, waiting for some explanation to present itself. But none came. The room was silent. The flowers gave off a faint, sweet smell. The lighting cast soft shadows across her face. And then, very slowly, I saw her fingers move. Not a twitch, not a spasm, a deliberate unclenching, as if she were releasing something she'd been holding. The movement lasted maybe 3 seconds, and then her hands settled back into place, fingers interlaced, left over right. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stood there, frozen, watching her still face, her closed eyes, her chest that would never rise again. I don't know how long I stayed in that room. Eventually, I turned off the lights, locked the door, and went home. The funeral was the next day. The casket was closed for transport and burial, and I didn't see Eleanor again. But I think about her constantly. I think about the way her hands moved when no one was watching, the careful repositioning, the deliberate gestures. Was she trying to tell me something? Was she reaching for someone? Or was it just the body doing what bodies do, settling and shifting in ways I don't understand? I've worked in this profession long enough to know that death isn't always still. But Eleanor Pritchard's hands didn't just move. They changed with intention, over and over, as if she were practicing something, perfecting a gesture, waiting for the right moment. I still prepare bodies the same way. I still fold their hands carefully, left over right. But now, every time I leave the room, I wonder, when I come back, will they be the same? Or will they have moved, just slightly, reaching for something I can't see? It appeared in the same seat every night, at exactly 3:47 a.m. My name is Marcus, and I'm a night security attendant at Green Hill Memorial Chapel. I've worked here for 6 years, monitoring the building overnight, while families rest and services are prepared for the next day. It's quiet work, too quiet sometimes, but I prefer it to daylight shifts. No crowds, no noise, just me and the hum of the cameras. We have 12 security cameras throughout the facility. 8 are standard visible light cameras covering entrances, hallways, and the parking lot. 4 are infrared cameras installed in the chapel, viewing rooms, and cold storage. The infrared feeds are grainy, heat signature based, showing warm bodies as white shapes against a dark background. They're meant to detect intruders or environmental issues, and in 6 years, they've caught nothing more interesting than a raccoon in the loading bay. Until last Monday, I was doing my routine sweep of the monitors around 3:30 a.m. when I noticed something on IR camera 3, the one covering the main chapel. A heat signature, human-shaped, sitting in the third pew from the front, right side. I stared at the screen, confused. The chapel had been empty since the last service ended at 8 p.m. I'd checked it myself during my 10 p.m. rounds. All the doors were locked. No one could have entered without triggering the perimeter alarms. I switched to the visible light camera, aimed at the chapel entrance. Empty hallway. No movement. I cycled through the other cameras. Nothing. But when I returned to IR camera 3, the signature was still there. A pale, human-shaped glow, sitting motionless in the pew. I grabbed my flashlight and keys and headed to the chapel. The hallway was dark except for the exit signs, and my footsteps echoed on the tile floor. When I reached the chapel doors, I paused, listening. Silence. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The chapel was empty, completely empty. Rows of wooden pews, a simple altar at the front, soft ambient lighting from the wall sconces. No one sitting, no one hiding. I walked down the center aisle. checking each row, and found nothing. I returned to the security office and checked the monitor again. The heat signature was gone. The chapel feed showed a dark, empty room. I looked at the timestamp, 3:51 a.m. I'd been in the chapel for less than 4 minutes. I filed a report noting a possible equipment malfunction and continued my rounds. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I'd almost convinced myself it was a glitch. Old camera, infrared interference, something logical. But the next night, it happened again. 3:47 a.m. Same camera, same pew, same human-shaped heat signature. This time, I didn't go to the chapel right away. I watched the monitor, noting details. The signature wasn't moving. It didn't shift or fidget the way a living person would. It just sat there, perfectly still, radiating a faint warmth. I checked the timestamp and set a timer on my phone. At 3:58 a.m., 11 minutes later, the signature faded and disappeared. I went to the chapel immediately after. Again, it was empty. No warmth lingering in the pew, no indentation in the cushion, nothing. I even placed my hand on the seat where the signature had been. It was cool to the touch. I didn't file a report that night. I wasn't sure what to say. Equipment malfunction seemed less likely now that it had happened twice, at the exact same time, in the exact same location. But what else could it be? On the third night, I brought a thermometer and a notebook. I stationed myself in the security office at 3:40 a.m. and waited. When the signature appeared at 3:47, I noted the exact position, third pew, right side, approximately 4 feet from the aisle. Then I ran to the chapel with the thermometer. The room was empty, but I went directly to the third pew and measured the air temperature. 68 degrees Fahrenheit, consistent with the rest of the chapel. I measured the seat cushion. Same temperature. No anomalies. No warmth. Nothing to explain the heat signature on the camera. I returned to the security office. The signature was still there. I watched it for the full 11 minutes, and at 3:58 a.m., it vanished. By the fourth night, I was obsessed. I reviewed the IR footage from the previous weeks, scrolling back through hours of recordings, and found it. Every single night, without exception, a heat signature appeared in the third pew at 3:47 a.m. and disappeared at 3:58 a.m. 11 minutes, always the same. I started arriving earlier, positioning myself in the chapel before the signature appeared. On the fifth night, I sat in the second pew at 3:45 a.m., with all the lights off, waiting. The chapel was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. 3:47 a.m. arrived. I felt nothing. No change in temperature, no presence, no sound. I sat there in the dark, straining to hear or see anything unusual. But the chapel remained empty and still. When I returned to the security office at 4 a.m., I checked the footage. The heat signature had appeared right behind me, in the third pew, exactly where it always did. I'd been sitting less than 6 feet away, and I'd felt nothing. On the sixth night, I brought my supervisor, Angela. She'd worked at Greenhill for 14 years and had a no-nonsense attitude toward anything she considered superstition. I showed her the footage from the previous nights and explained the pattern. She was skeptical but agreed to watch the monitor with me. At 3:47 a.m., the signature appeared. Angela leaned forward, staring at the screen. "That's definitely something," she said quietly. We watched it together for the full 11 minutes. At 3:58, it faded. "Could be a reflection," she offered, "or heat bleed from the HVAC system." But neither of us believed it. Reflections don't appear on a schedule. HVAC systems don't create human-shaped signatures that sit motionless in pews. On the seventh night, I decided to try something different. At 3:45 a.m., I positioned myself in the chapel again. But this time, I brought a voice recorder. I sat in the third pew, the exact spot where the signature appeared, and waited. 3:47 a.m. I pressed record. For 11 minutes, I sat in that pew, in the dark, with the recorder running. I didn't speak. I barely breathed. I just listened. The chapel was silent, except for the faint hum of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of the building settling. At 3:58 a.m., I turned off the recorder and returned to the security office. The IR footage confirmed what I already knew: the heat signature had appeared in the pew, overlapping with where I'd been sitting, as if someone had been sitting in the same space, occupying the same seat, invisible and silent. I played back the voice recording. For the first 9 minutes, there was nothing but ambient noise and my own breathing. But at 3:56 a.m., 2 minutes before the signature disappeared, I heard something. A voice. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A woman's voice. Humming. Not a song I recognized, just a soft, lilting melody. The kind someone might hum while waiting. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, and then it stopped. I played it for Angela the next day. She listened 3 times, her face growing paler each time. "That's not interference," she said. "That's a person." But no person had been in the chapel. I knew that with absolute certainty. The doors were locked, the alarms were armed. I'd been sitting in the exact spot, and I'd heard nothing. I've been working at Greenhill for 7 weeks since that recording. Every night, at 3:47 a.m., the heat signature appears in the third pew. I don't go to the chapel anymore. I just watch the monitor, noting the time, documenting the pattern. 11 minutes. Always the same. Angela requested a review of the infrared system, and a technician came out last week. He tested the camera, checked for interference, calibrated the sensors. Everything was functioning perfectly. "No malfunction," he said. "Whatever it's picking up is really there." I haven't told anyone about the voice recording. I keep it on my phone, and sometimes, late at night when the building is silent, I play it back. That soft humming, so gentle and sad, like someone waiting for a service that never comes. I don't know who she is, or why she appears, but she's there every night, sitting in the same pew, at the same time, for the same 11 minutes. And I've stopped trying to explain it. Some things I've learned don't need an explanation. They just need to be witnessed. The flowers appeared every week, but no one was leaving them. My name is Elise, and I've worked as a cemetery maintenance coordinator at Oakmont Memorial Gardens for 8 years. I oversee landscaping, grave care, and memorial upkeep across 42 acres. It's peaceful work, pruning hedges, planting seasonal flowers, ensuring that every grave is treated with respect. I take pride in keeping the cemetery beautiful, a place where families can find solace. But there's one grave that I've learned to leave alone. It's in Section C, Row 12, Plot 17. A small granite marker set flush with the ground, engraved with the name Lily Carver and the dates June 4th, 1941 to October 2nd, 1947. She was 6 years old. The inscription below her name reads, "Our little light, too bright for this world." I first noticed the roses in late April. I was doing my weekly inspection of Section C when I saw them, a bundle of white roses, fresh and fully bloomed, laid carefully across Lily's marker. They were beautiful, the petals still damp with dew, as if they'd been placed that morning. I didn't think much of it. Families visit graves, they leave flowers, stuffed animals, mementos. It's part of the grieving process. I made a note to check back the following week and continued my rounds. 7 days later, the roses were still there, but they weren't wilted. They looked exactly as fresh as they had the week before. Petals bright, stems green and firm. That struck me as odd. Fresh flowers don't last a week in outdoor conditions, especially in spring when the nights are still cool and damp. I knelt down and picked up the bundle. There was no card, no florist's wrapping, just a simple white ribbon tied around the stems. I examined the petals closely. They were perfect, no browning, no signs of decay. It was as if they'd been placed that morning, even though I knew they'd been there for at least 7 days. I set them back down and checked the security footage. Oakmont has 6 cameras positioned throughout the cemetery, covering the main entrance, the chapel, and several high-traffic sections. Section C isn't covered, but I reviewed the entrance footage to see if anyone had visited recently. Nothing. No visitors matched the time frame. The next week, the roses were replaced. The old bundle was gone, and a new one lay in its place. Same white roses, same white ribbon, same immaculate condition. I checked the cameras again. No record of anyone entering the cemetery during the early morning hours, when the flowers might have been placed. I started paying closer attention. Every Sunday morning, I walked to Section C first thing, and every time, there were fresh roses on Lily Carver's grave. No wilting, no decay. Just perfect white blooms that looked as if they'd been cut that morning. I asked around. The cemetery director checked the records and found that Lily's family, her parents, had both passed away decades ago. There were no living relatives listed, no one with active visitation rights. The plot had been abandoned, in a legal sense, since 1973. Maybe it's a volunteer group, the director suggested, or someone from a local church. But that didn't explain how the roses stayed fresh, or why there was no record of anyone entering the cemetery. In mid-May, I decided to stay overnight. I told my husband I was working late on inventory and parked my car near the maintenance shed with a clear view of Section C. I brought coffee, a blanket, and my phone, and I waited. The sun set around 8:15 p.m. I watched as the light faded and the cemetery grew dark. By 10 p.m., the only illumination came from the streetlights along the perimeter fence and the faint glow of the moon. I sat in my car, watching the silhouette of Lily's grave, waiting for someone to appear. Nothing happened. No visitors. No movement. By 2 a.m., I was exhausted and starting to doubt myself. Maybe the roses were artificial. Maybe I'd been mistaken about their freshness. But then, just before dawn, I saw something. A figure. Small, indistinct, moving slowly through the rows of graves toward Section C. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the light was too dim. It looked like a woman, maybe, or a young girl. She walked with a slow, deliberate gait, as if she knew exactly where she was going. She stopped at Lily's grave. She knelt down, and even from 50 yards away, I could see her place something on the marker. I opened my car door as quietly as I could and started walking toward her. My heart was pounding. I wanted to call out, to ask who she was, but something stopped me. The way she moved, the stillness of her posture, it didn't feel right. I was maybe 20 yards away when she stood up and turned toward me. For a moment, I saw her face, or thought I did. Pale, indistinct, like a photograph left too long in the sunday. And then she was gone. Not walking away, not running, just gone. As if she'd stepped through a curtain I couldn't see. I stood there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The cemetery was silent. The air was still. And when I finally forced myself to walk to Lily's grave, I found the roses, fresh white roses, tied with a white ribbon, laid perfectly across the marker. I picked them up. My hands were shaking. The stems were cold, damp with dew, and the petals were flawless. But the moment my skin touched them, I felt it. A burning sensation, sharp and sudden, like touching a hot stove. I dropped the bundle and stumbled backward. My palm was blistered. Small, red welts had formed where I'd gripped the stems, even though I'd held them for less than 3 seconds. I stared at my hand, then at the roses lying on the grass, and watched in horror as they began to change. The petals browned and curled. The stems withered. Within seconds, the roses aged decades, crumbling into brittle fragments that looked like they'd been dead for years. The white ribbon disintegrated into threads, and then dust, scattering in a breeze I couldn't feel. I ran back to my car. I sat there until the sun came up, cradling my blistered hand, staring at the grave. When the cemetery opened at 7 a.m., I drove straight to urgent care. The doctor treated the burns and asked what had caused them. I told her I'd touched a hot pipe. She didn't question it. I didn't return to Section C for 2 weeks. When I finally did, there were fresh roses on Lily's grave. White, perfect, tied with a ribbon. I didn't touch them. I didn't go near them. I just stood at a distance and looked. I've seen the roses every week since then. They appear every Sunday, without fail, and they remain fresh until the following Sunday when they're replaced. I've stopped checking the cameras. I've stopped asking questions. I've learned that some things in this cemetery don't follow the rules I understand. My hand healed, but the scars remain small, circular marks on my palm where the stems touched skin. Sometimes, late at night, they ache. And when they do, I think about Lily Carver, 6 years old, buried in 1947. And I wonder who's been leaving flowers on her grave for almost 80 years. I don't think it's a person, not anymore. But whoever or whatever it is, they loved her. And they're still visiting, every week, leaving roses that don't wilt and don't age until someone tries to take them away. I walk past that grave every week now. I don't disturb the flowers. I don't ask questions. I just acknowledge them, quietly, and move on. Because some acts of mourning, I've learned, are not meant to be understood. They're meant to be left alone. His mouth kept opening, and by the third time, he left me a message. My name is Owen, and I've been a transport driver for Mercy Mortuary Services for 12 years. I move bodies from hospitals, homes, and hospice centers to funeral homes and crematoriums. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, and I've always been good at staying detached. You have to be. You can't let every death affect you, or you'll burn out within a year. But there are some transports you can't forget. Mr. Cade was one of them. I received the call on a Wednesday afternoon. Pickup from St. Catherine's Hospital. Delivery to Riverside Crematorium. The deceased was Walter Cade, 74 years old. Died of respiratory failure. Standard transport. I'd done hundreds just like it. I arrived at St. Catherine's around 4 p.m. and met with the hospital coordinator. She handed me the paperwork, and I wheeled the gurney to the morgue. Mr. Cade was in a body bag, sealed and tagged. I transferred him carefully, secured the straps, and loaded him into the van. The drive to Riverside Crematorium takes about 30 minutes on a good day. I merged onto the highway, kept the radio low, and settled into the familiar rhythm of the drive. I try not to think about what I'm carrying. It's easier that way. About 15 minutes in, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The back of the van was visible from the driver's seat, windowless, lined with reinforced panels and secured with tie-downs. Everything looked normal, but something made me look twice. The body bag had shifted. Not much, just slightly to the left. I told myself it was the motion of the van, the way bodies settle during transport. It happens sometimes. I adjusted my mirror and kept driving. 5 minutes later, I checked again. The bag had shifted more, and this time, I noticed something else. The zipper was open. Not all the way, just a few inches, exposing the top of Mr. Cade's head. I pulled over onto the shoulder, put the van in park, and climbed into the back. The bag was definitely open. I could see his face pale, slack, eyes closed. His mouth was open, jaw hanging loosely. That wasn't unusual. Jaws relax after death. But I was certain the bag had been fully zipped when I'd loaded him. I zipped it back up, checked the straps, and returned to the driver's seat. Maybe the zipper had caught on something. Maybe I hadn't sealed it properly. I continued the drive, keeping one eye on the mirror. 10 minutes later, the zipper was open again. Wider this time. I could see his entire face. I pulled over again, more rattled now, and climbed into the back. Mr. Cade's mouth was open, wide open, as if he were trying to speak. I reached down and gently closed his jaw, pressing upward until it clicked into place. Then I zipped the bag completely, double-checking the seal, and used a small zip tie to secure the zipper pull. It couldn't open now, not without force. I drove the rest of the way without stopping, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, trying to ignore the crawling sensation on the back of my neck. When I arrived at Riverside Crematorium, I parked and took a moment to steady myself before opening the back doors. The zip tie was broken, the bag was open, and Mr. Cade's mouth was gaping wide, wider than it should have been, as if his jaw had been wrenched open by force. I called for the crematorium operator, a man named Jim who'd worked there for 20 years. He came out, took one look, and frowned. "That's not normal," he said quietly. Together, we transferred Mr. Cade to the preparation table. Jim examined the body briefly, checking for signs of rigor or gas buildup that might explain the jaw's position. "Rigor's past," he said. "Shouldn't be doing this." He closed Mr. Cade's mouth manually, using a strap to hold the jaw in place, and we proceeded with the paperwork. The cremation was scheduled for the next morning. I handed over the documents, got Jim's signature, and left. I tried to forget about it. I had 2 more transports that evening, both routine, and by the time I got home, I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing. Bodies do strange things. Gas buildup, muscle contractions, settling, it all happens. I'd just never seen a jaw open that aggressively. But then I checked my phone. I had a voicemail. The call had come in while I was driving back from Riverside, around 6:15 p.m. The number was unknown. I played the message. At first there was nothing but static and a faint rustling sound, like fabric moving. And then I heard it, breathing, slow, labored, and wet, as if someone were struggling to draw air through fluid-filled lungs. The breathing lasted maybe 10 seconds. And then, in a voice so faint I had to replay it 3 times to be sure, I heard my name. Owen, just that. My name, whispered in a hoarse, rattling voice that didn't sound human. I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes, staring at my phone, replaying the message over and over. The voice didn't match anything I'd heard before. It was too rough, too strained, like something forcing itself to speak through a throat that no longer worked. I called Jim. He answered on the 3rd ring, and I asked if anyone had been near Mr. Cade's body after I'd left. He said no. The body had been placed in the cooler and wouldn't be touched until morning. "Why?" he asked. I didn't know how to explain it. I told him I'd call him back and hung up. I saved the voicemail. I didn't delete it, even though every instinct told me to. I needed proof that I hadn't imagined it. The next day, I called Riverside to confirm the cremation had been completed. Jim said everything went smoothly. No issues. Mr. Cade was gone. But the voicemail is still on my phone. I've played it for exactly 3 people: my wife, my brother, and a colleague who's been in the business longer than I have. All 3 heard the same thing: breathing, my name, a voice that shouldn't exist. My wife thinks it's a prank. My brother thinks it's interference, some kind of crossed signal. My colleague didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a long time and then told me to be careful. I still work transports. I still drive bodies to crematoriums and funeral homes. But now, every time I load someone into the van, I check the zippers twice. I secure the bags with zip ties. And I keep my phone on silent because I don't want to hear another voicemail like that. I don't know if it was really Mr. Cade. I don't know if the dead can speak or if something else was using his voice. But I know what I heard. And I know that somewhere between Street, Catherine's Hospital, and Riverside Crematorium, something tried to reach me. Something that knew my name. I gave him a peaceful expression, but that's not what his daughter saw. My name is Jude, and I've been a mortician at Hillside Funeral Home for 16 years. I specialize in restorative work, preparing bodies for viewing, especially in cases of trauma or disfigurement. It's delicate work that requires both technical skill and artistic sensitivity. Families need to see their loved ones at peace, and it's my job to provide that. I take pride in my work. I always have. But what happened with Dennis Kowalski shook that pride in ways I'm still trying to understand. Dennis died on a Monday morning at 67, pancreatic cancer. He'd been in hospice for 3 weeks, and by the end, the pain was severe. His daughter, Rebecca, told me he'd been grimacing in his final hours, his face locked in an expression of agony even after he passed. She asked if I could fix it, make him look peaceful. I told her I could. I began the preparation that afternoon. Dennis's face was tense. The muscles contracted, his mouth pulled downward in a deep frown. His brow was furrowed, his eyes sunken. It was clear he'd suffered. I've seen this before. Pain leaves its mark, even after death. I started with the standard procedures: arterial embalming, setting the features, relaxing the facial muscles with massage and gentle manipulation. I worked slowly, carefully, easing the tension from his face. I closed his eyes, positioned his jaw, and used cotton and wax to restore volume to his cheeks. By the time I finished, Dennis looked calm, not happy, but serene. The frown was gone. His expression was neutral, restful. I stepped back and evaluated my work. It was good. Rebecca would be satisfied. I cleaned the prep room, documented the process, and moved Dennis to the viewing room, where he'd remain until the service. The viewing was scheduled for Wednesday evening. I arrived early to make final adjustments: lighting, floral arrangements, ensuring everything was perfect. When I entered the viewing room, I immediately checked Dennis's face. It looked exactly as I'd left it: calm, peaceful. Rebecca arrived at 5 p.m. with her husband and 2 teenage sons. I greeted them at the door, expressed my condolences, and gave them privacy. I stepped into the hallway, waiting nearby in case they needed anything. 3 minutes later, Rebecca screamed. I ran into the room. She was standing by the casket, her hand over her mouth, her face pale. Her husband had moved to her side, and the boys stood frozen near the door. I rushed to the casket, expecting something terrible: an open incision, a misplaced feature, some catastrophic error. But what I saw stopped me cold. Dennis was smiling, a wide, serene smile that stretched across his face, peaceful and content. His lips were curved upward, his cheeks slightly raised, as if he'd died in a moment of pure joy. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had not created that expression. "What did you do to him?" Rebecca whispered. Her voice was shaking. That's not my father." I didn't know what to say. I stared at Dennis's face, trying to process what I was seeing. The smile was perfect. Too perfect. The muscles were positioned exactly as they would be in life. The symmetry flawless. The expression utterly convincing. But it was wrong. I hadn't set his features that way. I'd given him a neutral, restful expression. Not this. I didn't do this," I said quietly. "This isn't what I prepared." Rebecca's husband stepped closer. "What do you mean you didn't do this? You're the mortician. Who else would have touched him?" I had no answer. I asked them to step outside for a moment, told them I needed to check something, and closed the door. My hands were shaking. I leaned over the casket and examined Dennis's face closely. The smile was anatomically perfect. Every muscle, every contour, every subtle detail was exactly as it should be for a genuine expression of happiness. But the muscles were rigid. Far too rigid to have moved naturally. Rigor mortis had long since passed. And facial muscles don't contract on their own. They certainly don't form complex expressions without intervention. I touched his cheek gently, feeling for any sign of manipulation or movement. The skin was cold, firm, unyielding. I checked the mouth, the jaw, the positioning. Everything was locked in place, as if the smile had been set deliberately and permanently. I called my supervisor, Marcus, and explained the situation. He arrived within 10 minutes, examined the body, and went silent. Finally, he said, "Did you use a mouth former?" "No." I set him with a neutral expression. I documented it. Marcus checked my notes. The documentation was clear, neutral positioning, standard feature setting, no smile. He looked at Dennis's face again and shook his head. This doesn't make sense. We called Rebecca back into the room and tried to explain. I told her that something had happened, something I couldn't account for, but that I would fix it. I asked for an hour to reset his features, to give him the peaceful expression I'd originally prepared. She agreed, reluctantly, and the family left. Marcus and I worked together. We attempted to relax Dennis's facial muscles, to reposition the mouth and cheeks, to remove the smile, but the muscles wouldn't respond. They were locked, fused in place, as if the expression had been burned into the tissue. We tried massage, we tried manual manipulation, we even tried injecting relaxant solution directly into the facial muscles. Nothing worked. The smile remained. Perfect. Immovable. Wrong. After an hour, we gave up. Marcus called Rebecca and explained that we couldn't change the expression, that we'd offer a full refund and transfer her father to another funeral home if she wished. She was angry, confused, and deeply upset. She agreed to the transfer. Dennis was moved to Riverside Memorial the next day. I wrote a detailed report noting everything I'd done and everything I'd observed. I included photographs of the preparation process, time-stamped and documented, showing the neutral expression I'd created. I called Riverside 3 days later and asked to speak with their mortician. Her name was Angela, and she'd been in the business for 20 years. I explained the situation and asked if she'd been able to change Dennis's expression. There was a long pause. Then she said, "No, I tried everything. The smile is permanent. I've never seen anything like it." How did the family react? They decided on a closed casket. I thanked her and hung up. I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the photographs I'd taken, trying to understand what had happened. I'd prepared Dennis with care, with skill, with all the expertise I'd developed over 16 years. I'd given him a peaceful expression, and somewhere between that moment and the viewing, his face had changed. Not settled, not shifted, changed. Into a smile I didn't create and couldn't remove. I've prepared dozens of bodies since then. I follow the same procedures, the same techniques, the same careful attention to detail. But now, every time I finish a preparation and step back to evaluate my work, I pause. I look at the expression I've created neutral, peaceful, serene, and I wonder, when I return the next day, will it be the same? Or will something else have taken over, shaping the face into an expression I didn't choose, for reasons I'll never understand? I think about Dennis Kowalski often. I think about that smile, so perfect and so wrong, and I wonder what he was seeing in those final moments of consciousness. Was it pain? Or was it something else? Something that made him smile in a way he never could have in life. I don't have answers. All I have is the memory of his daughter's scream, the feeling of those rigid muscles beneath my fingers, and the knowledge that sometimes the dead have their own expressions, and no matter how skilled you are, you can't change them. The grave was empty, but something was walking beneath our feet. My name is Director Martinez, and I've been conducting funeral services at Greenwood Cemetery for 19 years. I've presided over hundreds of burials, from small family gatherings to large public ceremonies. I know the rhythms of grief, the weight of silence, the way mourners stand at gravesides trying to find words that don't exist. It's solemn work, but I've always found meaning in it. But there are some services that stay with you, some moments that feel wrong in ways you can't articulate. The burial of Thomas Brennan was one of those moments. Thomas died at 81 after a short illness. He was a retired postal worker, well liked in his community, and his service was attended by over 40 people. The funeral was held on a Thursday morning in late September. A clear day with cool air and bright sunlight filtering through the cemetery's oak trees. The graveside service was scheduled for 11 a.m. I arrived early to coordinate with the cemetery staff. and ensure everything was prepared. The grave had been dug the previous afternoon, a standard 6-foot depth, clean walls, positioned in Section 7 near the older part of the cemetery. The grass around the plot was neatly trimmed, and the funeral chairs were arranged in rows facing the grave. Thomas's casket arrived at 10:45, and we positioned it on the lowering device. The family gathered, and I began the service. I've delivered these words hundreds of times, reflections on life, the inevitability of death, the hope of peace. The mourners listened quietly, some crying, some staring at the casket, all processing their grief in their own ways. I was midway through the committal prayer when I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, coming from beneath the ground. I paused, thinking I'd imagined it, and continued speaking. But the sound didn't stop. It was steady, deliberate, like someone walking slowly across a wooden floor. Thump, 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 measured and even. I glanced at the mourners. Several of them had stopped crying and were looking down at their feet, confused. An elderly woman in the front row frowned and shifted her position. A middle-aged man tilted his head, listening. The footsteps continued. They were louder now, more distinct, as if whatever was making them was moving closer to the surface. I looked at the open grave. The casket sat on the lowering device, suspended above the empty hole. The grave itself was pristine, no collapses, no disturbances, just clean earth and the faint smell of soil. But the sound was coming from below, from inside the grave, from a place that should have been empty. One of the mourners, a woman named Helen, spoke up. "Do you hear that?" Her voice was shaking. Others nodded. A younger man stood up from his chair and stepped closer to the grave, listening. "It sounds like someone walking." I raised my hand, trying to maintain composure. "Please, everyone, stay calm. There may be some settling in the adjacent plots." Or, the footsteps stopped. The cemetery fell silent. I could hear birds in the trees, the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of traffic on the main road. But beneath us, nothing. Just stillness. I resumed the service, speaking quickly now, wanting to finish and get the casket lowered before anything else happened. I said the final blessing, signaled to the cemetery workers, and watched as they activated the lowering device. The casket descended slowly, smoothly, into the grave. And the moment it touched the bottom, the footsteps returned. This time, they were frantic. Not slow and measured, but fast and desperate, like someone running. The sound echoed up from the grave, impossibly loud, and several mourners gasped. Helen stood up and backed away, her hand over her mouth. Others followed, moving toward their cars, abandoning the ceremony. I stood frozen, staring into the grave. The casket sat at the bottom, motionless and sealed. But the sound of running footsteps continued, pounding against earth and stone, as if someone were trapped beneath the casket, trying to get out. One of the cemetery workers, a man named Carl, grabbed a flashlight and leaned over the edge of the grave. He shone the light down, illuminating the casket and the dirt walls. "There's nothing there," he said, his voice tight. "I don't see anything." But we could all hear it. The pounding, the frantic, desperate footsteps. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I stood there, my heart racing, staring into the grave, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The casket sat undisturbed. The earth was still, and the mourners were leaving, walking quickly toward their cars, some of them crying, others just staring straight ahead in shock. I tried to call them back, to offer some explanation or comfort, but my voice felt hollow. I had no explanation. I'd never experienced anything like this in 19 years of conducting services. By the time the grave was filled, only 3 people remained, the cemetery workers and me. We worked in silence, shoveling dirt over the casket, tamping it down, restoring the plot to its proper level. No one spoke about what we'd heard. We just finished the work and left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing those footsteps, the way they'd shifted from slow and measured to fast and desperate. I kept thinking about the timing, how they'd started when the casket touched the bottom, as if something had been waiting for it. The next morning, I returned to the cemetery. I found Carl near the maintenance shed and asked if he'd heard anything unusual overnight. He shook his head. Nothing. It's been quiet. I walked to Thomas Brennan's grave. The earth was still fresh, slightly mounded, with flowers arranged carefully on top. Everything looked normal, peaceful, but I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd heard. I knelt down and pressed my hand against the soil, listening. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint vibration, like distant movement, but it was so subtle I couldn't be sure if it was real or imagined. I stood up and walked to the adjacent plots, checking the markers. To the left was Elizabeth Navarro, died in 2008. To the right was Michael Chen, died in 2012. Both graves were undisturbed, the grass grown thick and even over them. But directly beneath Thomas Brennan's plot, according to the cemetery maps, there should have been nothing. Just 6 feet of earth, then bedrock. No old graves. No forgotten burials. No tunnels or infrastructure. I requested a ground-penetrating radar scan of the area. The cemetery director was reluctant. It was expensive, and there was no official reason to suspect anything, but I insisted. The scan was conducted the following week. The results showed something I didn't expect. Beneath Thomas Brennan's grave, approximately 8 feet down, there was an anomaly. A void, roughly the size and shape of a casket, but positioned at a depth that predated any cemetery records. The technician said it could be a natural cavity, a collapsed section of earth, or possibly an unmarked burial from before the cemetery was established. I asked if we should excavate. The director refused. If there's something down there, it's been there for over 100 years. We're not disturbing it. So, Thomas Brennan remains buried above whatever was making those sounds. His grave is peaceful now, visited occasionally by his family, but I avoid that section of the cemetery. And when I conduct services near Section 7, I listen carefully, because I know what I heard, and I know that somewhere beneath the surface, in a space that shouldn't exist, something was walking, waiting. And when the casket finally descended, when Thomas Brennan joined it in the earth, it stopped. Maybe it found what it was looking for, or maybe it's still down there, silent now, patient, waiting for the next burial. I don't know, and I've decided I don't want to know. But every time I stand at a graveside, every time I lower a casket into the ground, I wonder, what's really beneath our feet? And when we bury our dead, are we truly laying them to rest? Or are we introducing them to something else? Something that's been waiting in the darkness, walking in circles, counting the footsteps until the next arrival. I still conduct services. I still offer comfort to grieving families. But I no longer assume that graves are just empty holes in the ground. And I never, ever stand directly over an open grave anymore. Because I remember those footsteps. And I remember the moment they stopped, right after the casket touched the bottom, as if something, at last, had found what it was searching for. I kept seeing him at funerals, always in the back, until I recognized his face. My name is Renee, and I've worked as a mortuary assistant at Riverside Memorial for 7 years. My job involves coordinating services, greeting families, and managing the administrative details that make funerals run smoothly. I interact with dozens of mourners every week, family members, friends, colleagues, clergy, and I've developed a sense for the rhythms of grief. I know how people move through funeral homes, where they stand, how they carry themselves. So when I started noticing the same man at multiple unrelated services, I paid attention. I first saw him in March, at a service for Dorothy Klein. She was 92, died peacefully, and her funeral was small, maybe 15 people. I was standing near the entrance to the chapel, greeting guests as they arrived, when I noticed him, an elderly man, maybe 75, with thinning white hair and a dark suit. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't sign the guest book. He just walked quietly to the back row and sat down. I thought he might be a distant relative or an old friend, someone Dorothy had known decades ago. After the service, I watched as families filed out, offering condolences to Dorothy's daughter. But the elderly man didn't approach. He simply stood, walked out through the side exit, and left. I saw him again 2 weeks later. This time, it was a service for Marcus Delgado, a 47-year-old man who died in a car accident. The funeral was larger, maybe 60 people, and the atmosphere was heavy with shock and grief. I was helping coordinate the procession when I saw him again, same elderly man, same dark suit, sitting alone in the back row of the chapel. I frowned. There was no connection between Dorothy Klein and Marcus Delgado. Different families, different demographics, different causes of death. So who was this man? After the service, I approached him. He was standing near the back, waiting for the chapel to empty. "Excuse me," I said gently. "Were you a friend of Marcus's family?" He looked at me with pale gray eyes and smiled faintly. "Just paying my respects," he said. His voice was soft, polite. He turned and walked toward the exit before I could ask anything else. Over the next 3 months, I saw him at 6 more funerals. Different deceased, different families, different circumstances. A young woman who died of an overdose. An 80-year-old veteran. A middle-aged teacher. A teenager killed in a drowning accident. And every time, the elderly man was there sitting in the back, silent and still. Never speaking to anyone. Never signing the guest book. I started keeping notes. I documented which services he attended, what time he arrived, how long he stayed. There was no pattern. The deceased were unrelated. Some were old, some were young. Some died naturally, some died tragically. The only constant was him always in the back row, always alone, always watching. In July, I decided to confront him more directly. The service was for a 16-year-old girl named Emily Cho, who died in a car accident. The chapel was packed with her classmates, her family, and members of her church community. And there, as expected, was the elderly man. This time, I waited until the service ended and positioned myself near the exit. When he stood to leave, I stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir. Can I speak with you for a moment?" He paused, his expression calm and unreadable. "Of course. I've noticed you've been attending several services here over the past few months. I'm just curious. How did you know Emily?" He looked at me for a long moment, his pale eyes steady. "I didn't." "Then, why are you here?" He smiled faintly. "Because someone should bear witness, even for strangers." The answer unsettled me, though I couldn't say why. "Are you a member of a church group? Or a volunteer organization?" "No, I just come to listen, to remember." He walked past me and out the door before I could ask anything else. I stood there, watching him disappear into the parking lot, and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. That night, I reviewed the surveillance footage from the past 4 months. Riverside has cameras at every entrance and exit, and I pulled up recordings from each service the elderly man had attended. I watched him arrive, sit, and leave. He never interacted with anyone. He never approached the deceased or the family. He just sat in the back row, his hands folded in his lap, his expression calm and distant. But there was something else I noticed, something I couldn't explain. In several of the recordings, just before he stood to leave, he would turn his head slightly and look directly at the casket. Not a quick glance, but a long, sustained stare, as if memorizing something. And in those moments, his expression changed. The faint smile disappeared, and his face became blank, empty, like he was looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. In August, I saw him again. This time, the service was for a man named Gerald Hoffman, 73, who died of a stroke. I'd prepared Gerald's body myself the previous week, working alongside our embalmer to ensure he looked peaceful for the viewing. I remembered his face clearly thin, weathered, with deep lines around his eyes. When I entered the chapel that afternoon to check the arrangements, I saw the elderly man sitting in the back row, and for the first time, I looked at him closely. Really looked. My breath caught. I knew that face. The shape of the jaw, the spacing of the eyes, the way the skin pulled taut over the cheekbones. I'd seen it before, recently. I walked quickly to the back office and pulled up my files. I searched through the intake records, scanning photographs of the deceased I'd processed over the past year. And then, I found it. Gerald Hoffman, 73 years old, died of a stroke, prepared for burial 14 months earlier. I stared at the photograph. The resemblance was undeniable. The elderly man sitting in the chapel looked exactly like Gerald Hoffman. Not similar, not close, identical. The same narrow face, the same pale gray eyes, the same thin white hair. But Gerald Hoffman had been dead for over a year. I'd been at his funeral. I'd watched his casket being lowered into the ground at Oakmont Cemetery. My hands were shaking. I printed the photograph and walked back to the chapel, holding it against my chest. The service was about to begin, and mourners were taking their seats. I scanned the back row. He was gone. I checked the exits, the hallways, the parking lot. No sign of him. I asked the receptionist if she'd seen an elderly man leave. She said she hadn't seen anyone matching that description all afternoon. But I knew he'd been there. I'd seen him with my own eyes, sitting in the same spot he always did, wearing the same dark suit, his hands folded in his lap. And he'd looked exactly like a man I'd prepared for burial 14 months ago. I called Oakmont Cemetery and asked to speak with the groundskeeper. I told him I needed to verify a burial. Gerald Hoffman, August of the previous year, Section 9, Plot 42. He checked the records and confirmed it. Gerald Hoffman was buried there. The grave had never been disturbed. "Why do you ask?" he said. I didn't know how to answer. I thanked him and hung up. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I pulled up every photograph I had of the deceased I'd processed over the past 2 years and compared them to my memory of the elderly man. None of them matched exactly, but there was something familiar in several of the faces, the shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, small similarities that, taken individually, meant nothing. But together, they formed a pattern. The elderly man wasn't one person. He was pieces of many people. Features I'd seen before, assembled into a face that looked real, but wasn't. A composite of the dead. I started attending every funeral at Riverside, watching for him. For 3 weeks, he didn't appear. I began to think I'd imagined the resemblance, that grief and exhaustion had made me see connections that didn't exist. And then, in September, I saw him again. The service was for a woman named Helen Vargas, 68, who died of heart failure. I was coordinating the guest book when he walked in. Same dark suit, same slow, deliberate gait. But this time, I was ready. I stepped in front of him before he could reach the chapel. "I need to speak with you." He stopped and looked at me with those pale gray eyes. Up close, his face was even more unsettling. The skin was smooth, almost waxy, and there was no warmth in his expression, just calm, empty calm. "Who are you?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me, as if considering the question. Finally, he said, "I'm no one. I'm everyone. I'm the last witness. You look like Gerald Hoffman, a man who died last year. I prepared his body." He smiled faintly. "Do I? I suppose I might." "That's not possible. He's buried." "Yes," he said simply. "He is." I felt my chest tighten. "What are you?" He tilted his head slightly, as if the question amused him. "I attend funerals. I sit quietly. I remember. That's all." "Why?" "Because someone should. Because the dead deserve to be seen, even by strangers." He stepped around me and walked into the chapel. I followed, my heart pounding, and watched as he took his usual seat in the back row. The service began, and I stood near the entrance, unable to focus on anything except him. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the casket. And then Near the end of the service, he turned his head and looked directly at me. His expression didn't change, but in that moment, I saw something in his eyes. Recognition. Not of me as a person, but of me as someone who'd seen too much. Someone who knew. After the service, I watched as he stood and walked toward the exit. This time, I didn't try to stop him. I just followed at a distance, keeping him in sight. He walked through the parking lot, past the rows of cars, and stopped at the edge of the property near the tree line. And then he turned and looked back at the funeral home. He stood there for a long moment, perfectly still, as if memorizing the building, the grounds, the people inside, and then he walked into the trees and disappeared. I ran to the spot where I'd last seen him. The trees were thick, the underbrush dense, but there was no sign of movement, no footprints, no broken branches, just silence. I haven't seen him since. It's been 3 months, and I've attended every service at Riverside, watching for him, waiting, but he's gone. Or maybe he's just moved on to another funeral home, another set of strangers to witness and remember. I still think about him constantly. I think about his face, so familiar and so wrong, assembled from pieces of people I'd prepared for burial. I think about his words. I'm no one. I'm everyone. And what they might mean. I've stopped trying to explain it. I can't. All I know is that for nearly 6 months, something attended our funerals. Something that wore the faces of the dead and sat quietly in the back row, watching, witnessing, remembering. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the mortuary, I wonder if he's still out there, attending services at other funeral homes, sitting in the back row, wearing a different face each time, watching the living mourn the dead, and carrying those memories with him into whatever darkness he came from. I don't know what he was, but I know what I saw. And I know that when I prepared Gerald Hoffman's body 14 months ago, I looked into his face and memorized every detail. And when I saw that elderly man sitting in our chapel, I was looking at the same face. The dead don't attend funerals, but something does, and it's wearing their faces. The body was real, but according to every record, it was never delivered. My name is Keisha, and I've been the night supervisor at Metropolitan Mortuary for 13 years. I oversee intake operations from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., coordinating body transfers from hospitals, nursing homes, and the medical examiner's office. It's methodical work, paperwork, verification, cold storage assignment, and I've processed thousands of intakes without incident. But on October 16th, I accepted a delivery that shouldn't exist. The call came in at 11:43 p.m. A transport driver from Mercy Hospital notified me that they were en route with a body. Standard procedure. I pulled up the intake log on my computer, verified the case number, and prepared the receiving area. The driver arrived at midnight. He was someone I'd never seen before, maybe mid-50s, wearing a dark jacket and a surgical mask. He handed me the transfer paperwork. Intake number 447. Deceased, Robert Milner, 61, cardiac arrest, pronounced dead at Mercy Hospital at 9:15 p.m. The paperwork was complete death certificate pending, next of kin notified, funeral home assignment, pending family decision. I signed the intake form, verified the body tag matched the paperwork, and wheeled the gurney to Cold Storage Unit 3. Standard procedure. I documented the time, 12:07 a.m., and the driver left. I locked the cold storage unit and returned to my desk to file the paperwork. That's when I noticed the intake log. Intake 447 was listed as vacant. No entry, no case number assigned. The last logged intake was 446, received at 7:20 p.m., and the next available number was 447, but it showed as unassigned. I frowned and checked the transfer paperwork again. It clearly stated intake number 447, Robert Milner, Mercy Hospital. Everything matched except the log entry. I assumed it was a data entry error, maybe a network glitch, and manually entered the information into the system. But the system rejected it. Error message. Intake number already exists. I stared at the screen. The log showed 447 as vacant, but the system claimed the number was already in use. That didn't make sense. I tried entering the information under intake 448 instead. The system accepted it, and I filed the paperwork. At 2 a.m., I did my routine check of the cold storage units. I opened Unit 3 and counted the bodies. 4 gurneys, all tagged and documented. I checked the tags against my log. Everything matched, including Robert Milner, now listed as intake 448. But then I saw it. A 5th gurney in the back corner. I walked closer, confused. The tag read, Intake 447, Robert Milner. My pulse quickened. I checked my log again. Robert Milner was intake 448. But here was a second body, tagged as 447, with the same name. I pulled back the sheet covering the face and felt my breath catch. It was him, the same man. Same facial features, same age, same identifying marks. I had 2 identical bodies of Robert Milner. One tagged as intake 447, one as 448. Both in cold storage unit 3. Both delivered the same night. I left the storage unit and checked the delivery log at the receiving desk. Only one delivery was recorded midnight. Intake 448. There was no record of a second delivery. No entry for intake 447. But the body was there. I'd seen it, touched it. I called the transport company that had delivered Robert Milner. The dispatcher checked their logs and confirmed a single pickup from Mercy Hospital at 11:30 p.m., delivered to Metropolitan Mortuary at midnight. Driver name, Jim Parsons. One body, one delivery. Can you give me Jim's phone number? I asked. I need to verify something. The dispatcher provided the number, and I called immediately. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. I left a message asking Jim to call me back as soon as possible. Then I called Mercy Hospital. The night coordinator checked their records and confirmed that Robert Milner had died at 9:15 p.m. One body released to Metropolitan Mortuary. One death certificate pending. One set of transfer paperwork. Was there any confusion? I asked. Any duplicate paperwork or tags? No, just the one case. Why? I didn't know how to explain it. I thanked her and hung up. I returned to cold storage unit 3. Both bodies were still there. Both tagged. Both identical. I examined the paperwork for intake 447, the one that shouldn't exist. It looked authentic. Same forms, same signatures, same hospital stamps. But according to every record I could access, this body was never delivered. At 4 a.m., I called my supervisor, Donald. He arrived within 20 minutes, examined both bodies, and checked the paperwork. His face went pale. This doesn't make sense, he said quietly. We can't have 2 intakes with the same deceased. One of them isn't logged, I said. 447 doesn't exist in the system. But the body is real. The paperwork is real. Donald checked the receiving area security footage. We reviewed the recordings from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. Only one delivery appeared on camera midnight. A driver wheeling a gurney through the entrance. Me signing paperwork. The body being transferred to cold storage. No second delivery. No second driver. But in the cold storage footage, taken at 12:15 a.m., both bodies were visible. Both gurneys. Both tagged. As if the second body had appeared between the time I left the storage unit and the time the camera recorded the interior. Could someone have brought it in through a side entrance? Donald asked. I shook my head. All doors are locked and alarmed after 10 p.m. Only the main entrance is active. And we'd have a record. We called the medical examiner's office, thinking maybe there'd been a mix-up with another Robert Milner. No other cases matched. We called surrounding hospitals. Nothing. We even checked obituaries and recent death records in the county database. Only one Robert Milner had died recently the one delivered at midnight. At 6 a.m., the day shift arrived, and I briefed them on the situation. We decided to contact Robert Milner's family and request clarification. His daughter, Patricia, arrived at the mortuary later that morning. Donald and I met with her privately. "We need to verify some details about your father's transfer," Donald said carefully. "Can you confirm which hospital he was at?" "Mercy Hospital," Patricia said. "He was pronounced dead around 9 p.m. They called me, and I authorized the transfer here." "Did anyone else authorize a transfer?" I asked. "Another family member, maybe?" She looked confused. "No, I'm his only child. His wife passed away 3 years ago." "Why?" Donald and I exchanged glances. He led Patricia to the viewing area where we'd prepared one of the bodies, intake 448. She identified her father immediately, crying quietly as she touched his hand. "Is this him?" Donald asked gently. "Yes, that's my father." We thanked her and escorted her out. Then we returned to Cold Storage Unit 3. The second body, intake 447, was gone. The gurney was empty, the tag removed, no paperwork, no trace. It had simply disappeared. I checked the security footage. Between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., no one had entered Cold Storage Unit 3 except Donald and me, but the body was gone. That afternoon, I tried calling Jim Parsons again, the transport driver. The number was disconnected. I called the transport company and asked to speak with Jim. The dispatcher said they had no driver by that name. They never had. "But you gave me his number," I said, my voice rising. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't have any record of that conversation." I hung up and checked my phone. The call log was there. I definitely called them. But according to the company, Jim Parsons didn't exist. I pulled the delivery paperwork from my files, the forms signed at midnight. The driver's signature was illegible, just a scrawl. And when I looked closely at the intake number, I realized something I'd missed before. The number 447 had been written over another number. Beneath it, faintly visible, was a different set of digits, 019. I searched the archives for intake 019. It took me 3 hours of digging through old records, but I finally found it. Intake 019. Robert Milner, delivered to Metropolitan Mortuary on March 4th, 1997, 28 years ago. The case file was thin. Robert Milner, 61, cardiac arrest. Pronounced dead at Mercy Hospital. Delivered by transport driver. But there was a note at the bottom of the file, handwritten by the night supervisor at the time. Intake rejected. Body unclaimed. Transferred to county morgue. I don't understand what happened that night. I know I signed paperwork. I know I wheeled a body into cold storage. I know I saw 2 identical bodies, both tagged as Robert Milner, one with an intake number that didn't exist in the system. And I know that by morning, one of them was gone, as if it had never been delivered at all. Robert Milner, the real Robert Milner, intake 448, was buried 3 days later. His daughter held a small service, and we never mentioned the second body. How could we? We had no explanation, no records, no proof. But I still have the paperwork. Intake 447, the transfer forms signed by a driver who doesn't exist. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the mortuary, I think about that second body, where it came from, why it appeared, and where it went when no one was looking. I've stopped trying to find answers. All I know is that on October 16th, something was delivered to Metropolitan Mortuary, something that looked like Robert Milner, that carried his name and his paperwork, but existed outside every system we have for tracking the dead. And somewhere in our records, in a file that shouldn't exist, intake 447 is still marked as pending, waiting for someone to claim it, waiting to be logged, waiting in a space between what's real and what's possible, where the dead arrive without being called and disappear without being released. I still work the night shift. I still process intakes. But now, every time I sign transfer paperwork, I check the intake number twice, and I make sure it matches the system before I accept the body. Because I've learned that not everything delivered to a mortuary belongs to the living world. Some deliveries come from somewhere else, and when they do, they leave no trace except the memory of the person who signed for them. I heard knocking from inside, but the seal had never been broken. My name is Paul, and I've been a funeral director at Cornerstone Memorial for 22 years. I've coordinated every type of service imaginable: celebrations of life, traditional burials, military honors, cremations. I've comforted countless families and helped them navigate the most difficult days of their lives. It's demanding work, but I've always found purpose in it. But some services test that purpose. Some moments make you question what you think you know about death. The service for Daniel Westbrook was one of those moments. Daniel died at 43 in a motorcycle accident. The trauma was severe, and the family requested a closed casket service. I met with his wife Amanda 2 days after his death, and she was clear about her wishes. "I don't want anyone to see him like that," she said. "I want people to remember him the way he was." I understood. In cases of traumatic death, closed caskets are often the kindest option. Daniel's body had been prepared by our mortician, placed in the casket, and sealed. The casket, a simple oak model with brass handles, was positioned in the chapel 3 hours before the service. I arrived early that Thursday afternoon to finalize arrangements. Flowers had been delivered. Photographs of Daniel were displayed on easels near the entrance, and the guest book was set up. Everything was ready. The casket sat at the front of the chapel, draped with a spray of white lilies, the lid closed and locked. At 2 p.m., guests began arriving. Friends, family, colleagues from Daniel's construction company. By 2:30, the chapel was nearly full. I stood near the entrance, greeting people, offering quiet words of comfort. The service was scheduled to begin at 3 p.m. At 2:55, I heard it. A sound, faint but distinct, coming from the front of the chapel. I paused mid-conversation and listened. It came again. 3 slow knocks. Wood on wood. Deliberate. I excused myself and walked toward the casket. Several mourners glanced at me, confused, but I kept my expression calm. When I reached the front, I stood beside the casket and listened. Silence. Maybe I'd imagined it. The chapel was full of people shifting in their seats, whispering to each other, adjusting their positions. Maybe the sound had come from somewhere else. I returned to the entrance and signaled to the officiant that we were ready to begin. He stepped to the podium and welcomed everyone. The service opened with a prayer, and I stood in the back, monitoring the room. And then I heard it again. 3 knocks. Louder this time. Unmistakable. Several people in the front rows turned toward the casket. A woman gasped. An older man stood up, his face pale. The officiant paused mid-sentence, staring at the casket. I moved quickly down the aisle and positioned myself beside the casket, my hand resting on the smooth wood. "Please, everyone remain calm," I said, keeping my voice steady. "There may be some settling. I'll check the arrangements." But I knew it wasn't settling. I'd heard those knocks. 3 slow, deliberate strikes from inside the casket. And judging by the reactions of the mourners, I wasn't the only one. I signaled to my assistant, Marcus, who was standing near the side door. He joined me at the front, and we carefully examined the casket. The seal was intact, a rubber gasket that runs along the interior edge of the lid, designed to create an airtight closure. The locking mechanism was engaged. There was no way the lid could open without deliberately releasing the locks. "Do you want to open it?" Marcus whispered. I shook my head. Amanda had been explicit. Closed casket, no viewing. And opening the casket in front of 100 mourners would be traumatic, especially if there was a logical explanation. "We'll continue the service," I said quietly. "Stay close." Marcus nodded, and I returned to the back of the chapel. The officiant resumed speaking, but the atmosphere had changed. People were no longer focused on the eulogy. They were watching the casket, waiting for another sound. It came 10 minutes later. This time it wasn't knocking. It was scratching. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, as if something inside the casket was dragging fingernails across wood. Amanda stood up from the front row, her face stricken. "What's happening?" she said, her voice breaking. "Why is that sound?" I moved to her side quickly. "Mrs. Westbrook, please, let's step outside for a moment." "That's coming from inside," she said, her eyes locked on the casket. "That's, oh God, is he. He's not alive, Mrs. Westbrook. I promise you. There's a logical explanation, but I didn't have one. And judging by the panic spreading through the chapel, no one else did either." The officiant stopped speaking. Several mourners stood and moved toward the exits. Others remained frozen in their seats, staring at the casket. And the scratching continued steady, rhythmic, as if something inside was testing the seal, searching for a way out. I made a decision. "Marcus, clear the chapel. Everyone outside. Now." Marcus began ushering people out, his voice calm but firm. Within 5 minutes, the chapel was empty, except for Amanda, Marcus, the officiant, and me. Amanda refused to leave. "I need to see him," she said. "I need to know what's happening. Mrs. Westbrook, open it, please." I looked at Marcus. He nodded. Together, we approached the casket. The scratching had stopped, but the silence felt heavier, more oppressive. I released the locking mechanism's 4 latches, one on each corner, and Marcus helped me lift the lid. Daniel Westbrook lay inside, exactly as the mortician had positioned him. His hands were folded across his chest, his eyes closed, his face pale but peaceful despite the injuries. He was dressed in a dark suit, and a small pillow supported his head. Everything looked normal, except for his hands. His fingernails were embedded with splinters, tiny fragments of wood, fresh and bright, caught beneath the nails of both hands. And when I looked closely at the interior of the casket lid, I saw scratches, deep, parallel grooves carved into the satin lining and the wood beneath. Amanda made a sound half gasp, half sob. She reached toward Daniel's hands, but I stopped her. "Please don't touch him." "He was alive," she whispered. "He was scratching. Oh God, he was trying to get out." "No," I said firmly. "He wasn't." The mortician confirmed he was deceased. The medical examiner signed the death certificate. "Daniel died 48 hours ago." "Then how do you explain that?" she said, pointing at the scratches. I didn't have an answer. I closed the lid gently and re-engaged the locks. "I'm going to call the medical examiner. We need to document this." The medical examiner arrived an hour later. She examined the casket, photographed the scratches, and inspected Daniel's hands. Her conclusion was immediate. "These splinters are fresh. They're embedded in the nail beds, which means they were acquired post-mortem. But the body shows no signs of life. No respiration, no pulse, no neurological activity. He's been dead for over 48 hours. Then how did the splinters get there?" Amanda asked. The medical examiner didn't answer. She just shook her head and continued documenting. "We held the burial the next day. Closed casket. Amanda requested that we seal the casket with additional screws and reinforcement, as if locking Daniel inside would prevent whatever had happened from happening again. I honored her request, though I'm not sure it mattered. The scratches were real. The splinters were real. And the knocking heard by over 100 mourners was real. But Daniel Westbrook had been dead for 2 full days before the service. There was no medical explanation for what happened. No rational cause. I've replayed that afternoon in my mind hundreds of times. I've examined every detail, searching for something I missed. But all I'm left with are questions. If Daniel was dead, what caused the knocking? What scraped those grooves into the casket lid? And why were his fingernails embedded with fresh splinters? I still conduct services at Cornerstone Memorial. I still prepare closed casket arrangements when families request them. But now, every time I stand beside a sealed casket, I listen. I wait for the sound of knocking, of scratching, of something inside trying to get out, because I know what I heard, and I know what I saw when we opened that casket. Daniel Westbrook had been dead for 48 hours. But something inside that casket, something wearing his hands, had been very much awake. And when we sealed him in the ground, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were burying him twice. Once when he died, and once again when we locked him inside a casket he'd already tried to escape. She visited the same grave every week until I learned she was buried there. My name is Al, and I've been a groundskeeper at Hilltop Cemetery for 26 years. I maintain 38 acres of graves, from the old section dating back to 1874 to the new section where recent burials are located. I know every path, every tree, every grave marker. I know which families visit regularly and which graves have been forgotten. It's quiet work, and I prefer it that way. But there's one grave that's haunted me for the past 2 years. Plot 73 in Section D, the grave of Margaret Chen. I first noticed the woman in April 2 years ago. I was trimming hedges near Section D when I saw her, a woman, maybe in her 60s, standing at Margaret Chen's grave. She was dressed simply in a long gray coat and a dark scarf, and she was holding a bundle of white lilies. She stood very still, her head bowed, as if in prayer. I didn't think much of it. People visit graves. They stand quietly, they leave flowers, they grieve. It's part of the natural rhythm of a cemetery. I finished my work and moved on. But the next Sunday, she was there again. Same time, early morning, just after dawn. Same grave, same white lilies. She stood for maybe 10 minutes, placed the flowers on the headstone, and then walked slowly toward the cemetery entrance. Over the following weeks, I began to notice a pattern. Every Sunday morning around 7 a.m., the woman appeared at Margaret Chen's grave. She always brought lilies. She always stood in the same position, and she always left the same way, walking slowly down the main path toward the gates. I started paying closer attention. Margaret Chen had died in November of 2021 at the age of 62. According to the cemetery records, she had one daughter, Elizabeth Chen, listed as next of kin. The grave was well maintained, the headstone simple but elegant, engraved with Margaret's name and the words, "Beloved Mother, forever missed." In June, I decided to introduce myself. I'd been working at Hilltop long enough to recognize dedicated visitors, and this woman's consistency was remarkable. One Sunday morning, I positioned myself near Section D and waited. When she arrived at 7 a.m., I approached her respectfully. "Good morning," I said quietly. "I'm Al, one of the groundskeepers here. I've noticed you visit every week. I just wanted to say, it's nice to see someone so dedicated." She turned toward me, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. She was older than I'd thought, maybe 70s, with pale skin and deep-set eyes. She smiled faintly. "Thank you. It's important to visit. Are you family?" I asked. "In a way," she said. "We were very close." I nodded. Margaret must have been a special person. She was my mother. I felt a small jolt of recognition. "You must be Elizabeth." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "Yes, I'm Elizabeth." We spoke briefly. She told me she lived about an hour away but made the drive every Sunday to visit her mother. She thanked me for keeping the cemetery beautiful, and I told her it was my pleasure. She placed the lilies on the grave, bowed her head for a moment, and then walked away. Over the next year, I saw her dozens of times. We developed a quiet rapport. Sometimes we exchanged greetings. Sometimes we just nodded. But she never missed a Sunday. In March of this year, I had a conversation with the cemetery director about updating our records. We were digitizing old files, and I mentioned Margaret Chen's grave, noting that her daughter visited every week. The director frowned. "Elizabeth Chen?" "Yes. She drives an hour every Sunday to visit." He pulled up the records on his computer and went silent. After a moment he said, "Al, Elizabeth Chen is buried here." I stared at him. "What?" He turned the screen toward me. There it was. Elizabeth Chen. Date of death: September 8th, 2022. Cause of death: automobile accident. Buried in Section D, Plot 74. Right next to her mother. I felt my chest tighten. That's not possible. I've been talking to her for a year. Are you sure it was Elizabeth? She told me her name. She said Margaret was her mother. The director checked the records again. Margaret Chen had one daughter, Elizabeth, and she's been dead for over a year. I walked to Section D immediately. I found Margaret Chen's grave, Plot 73, and looked at the adjacent plot, Plot 74. The headstone read, Elizabeth Chen, January 12, 1962 to September 8, 2022. Reunited with her mother. I stood there, staring at the two graves side by side, trying to process what I'd just learned. The woman I'd been speaking with, the woman who visited every Sunday, was buried 3 feet away from the grave she'd been visiting. That Sunday, I arrived at the cemetery before dawn and positioned myself near Section D. At 7 a.m., she appeared. Same gray coat, same dark scarf, same bundle of white lilies. She walked slowly to Margaret's grave, stood in her usual position, and placed the flowers on the headstone. I approached her, my heart pounding. Elizabeth? She turned toward me and smiled. Good morning, Al. I need to ask you something, I said carefully. When did your mother die? November of 2021. And when did you start visiting? After she was buried. I couldn't let her be alone. I hesitated. Do you remember September of 2022? Her expression didn't change. Of course. That's when I moved closer, so I could visit more often. I didn't know what to say. I looked at her closely, her pale skin, her deep-set eyes, the way she seemed slightly translucent in the early morning light. And I realized I'd never seen her arrive or leave through the gates. She just appeared near the grave and disappeared down the path. Are you all right, Al? She asked. I'm fine, I said quietly. I'm glad you visit. Your mother is lucky to have you, she smiled. I'll always visit, even when I'm gone. She turned and walked down the path toward the entrance. I watched her until she faded into the morning mist, and then I walked to Plot 74, Elizabeth Chen's grave. The flowers I'd seen her place on her mother's grave were now wilting on her own headstone. I've seen her every Sunday since then. She appears at 7 a.m., places lilies on her mother's grave, and then fades into the distance. I don't approach her anymore. I just watch from a distance, acknowledging her presence with a quiet nod. 3 months ago, I mentioned Elizabeth to her mother's grave, or rather, to the woman buried in Plot 73. I said, your daughter loves you very much. She's never missed a visit. The next Sunday, there were 2 bundles of lilies, one on Margaret's grave, one on Elizabeth's. Both fresh, both white, both tied with the same ribbon. I don't know who left the second bundle, but I like to think that maybe, in whatever space exists between life and death, Margaret Chen visits her daughter too. And on Sunday mornings, when the cemetery is quiet and the light is soft, they stand together at their graves, mother and daughter leaving flowers for each other. I still maintain Section D. I still trim the hedges and mow the grass around Plots 73 and 74. And every Sunday morning, I make sure to arrive early, before the sun is fully up, to watch for Elizabeth. She never disappoints. She appears like clockwork, walks to her mother's grave, places her lilies with care, and stands in silent devotion. And when she turns to leave, sometimes she looks at me and smiles. A sad, gentle smile that acknowledges what we both know, but can never speak aloud. That she's been dead for over 2 years. That she's buried 3 feet from the grave she visits. And that love, apparently, doesn't end when the heart stops beating. I've worked in cemeteries long enough to know that the dead don't always stay quiet. Sometimes they linger. Sometimes they visit. And sometimes, if they loved deeply enough, they return every Sunday morning with white lilies to stand at a grave and remember. Elizabeth Chen died in September of 2022. But every Sunday, she comes back. And I've stopped trying to explain it. Because some acts of love are stronger than death. And some daughters will visit their mothers forever, no matter which side of the grave they're standing on. I felt warm air on my cheek while suturing a dead man's lips. My name is Sophia, and I've been an embalmer at Lakeside Funeral Home for 14 years. I've prepared over 3,000 bodies during that time, and I approach each one with the same care and respect. Embalming is both science and art, preserving the body, restoring a peaceful appearance, preparing the deceased for their final viewing. It's intimate work that requires steady hands and emotional distance. But there are moments when that distance collapses, when something happens that breaks through your professional detachment and makes you question everything you thought you understood. What happened with Thomas Harlow was one of those moments. Thomas died at 78 after a long battle with emphysema. His death was expected, peaceful, and his family requested a traditional viewing. I received his body on a Wednesday afternoon and began the standard preparation process: arterial embalming, setting features, dressing, and final cosmetic work. Thomas's face was gaunt from his illness, his cheeks sunken, his skin sallow. I worked carefully to restore volume and color, using massage techniques and cosmetic fillers to give him a more natural appearance. By early evening, I was satisfied with the results. His face looked peaceful, his color healthy, his expression serene. The final step was suturing his mouth closed. It's a standard procedure: inserting a needle through the lower jaw, threading wire through the upper jaw, and tying them together to keep the mouth naturally closed. I've done it thousands of times. It's delicate work that requires me to lean in close, positioning my face just inches from the deceased. I prepared the needle and wire, tilted Thomas's head back slightly, and leaned forward. My face was maybe 6 inches from his. I inserted the needle through the lower jaw and began threading it upward toward the upper palate. And that's when I felt it. Warm air on my left cheek. A slow, deliberate exhale, as if someone had breathed out gently right next to my face. I froze. My hands stopped moving. The needle was still in position, the wire half threaded. I stayed perfectly still, listening, feeling. The embalming room was silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system. But I'd felt it clearly: warm breath on my skin, coming from the direction of Thomas's face. I pulled back slowly and examined him. His mouth was partially open, the position I'd left it in before suturing. His chest was still. His body was cold. There was no movement, no sign of respiration. I checked his eyes, pupils fixed and dilated. I placed my hand on his chest: no rise, no fall, no heartbeat. But I'd felt that breath, warm, deliberate, as if he'd turned his head toward me and exhaled. I steadied myself and returned to the procedure. Maybe it was gas release. Post-mortem gases can escape through various orifices, creating sounds and sensations that mimic breathing. It happens sometimes, though usually much earlier in the decomposition process. Thomas had been dead for less than 24 hours, and his body showed no signs of advanced gas buildup. I leaned in again, positioning my face close to his, and continued threading the wire. My hands were shaking slightly, but I forced myself to focus. Professional distance, clinical precision. Just finish the work. As I pulled the wire through and prepared to tie it off, I felt it again. Warm air. This time it was stronger, more sustained, as if someone had exhaled a full breath directly onto my cheek. The warmth lasted maybe 3 seconds, and then it stopped. I jerked backward, dropping the needle. It clattered onto the stainless steel table, and the sound echoed in the quiet room. I stood there, breathing hard, staring at Thomas's still face. His mouth was partially open, the wire dangling from his jaw. His eyes were closed, his chest was motionless. I picked up the needle with trembling hands and forced myself to continue. I had to finish. The family was expecting a viewing the next day, and I couldn't leave the body unprepared. I leaned in one more time, keeping my face as far from his as possible while still being able to work, and completed the suturing. The moment I tied off the wire and stepped back, I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A soft exhalation, like someone releasing a held breath. It came from Thomas's body, from his chest, his throat, somewhere inside that should have been silent. I grabbed my stethoscope from the counter and pressed it against his chest. Silence. No heartbeat. No lung sounds. No movement. I checked his mouth. The sutures were tight. The lips closed. I checked his nostrils. No airflow. Nothing. But I'd heard it. That soft exhalation, so close to my ear it felt like he'd been trying to tell me something. I cleaned up quickly, documented the procedure, and moved Thomas to the viewing room. I didn't mention what had happened to anyone. What would I say? That a dead man had breathed on me? That I'd felt warm air from a body that had been cold for 24 hours? I tried to rationalize it. Gases, muscle contractions, auditory hallucinations brought on by exhaustion. I'd been working long hours, preparing multiple bodies, and maybe my mind was playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling, the warmth on my cheek, the sound of that breath, the sensation that Thomas Harlow, dead for a full day, had been trying to speak. The viewing was held the next afternoon. I arrived early to make final adjustments and found Thomas exactly as I'd left him. Peaceful. Still. His sutured mouth was closed, his hands folded, his face composed. The family arrived, and the viewing proceeded without incident. His wife stood by the casket for a long time, holding his hand, whispering things I couldn't hear. When she finally stepped away, she thanked me for making him look so peaceful. "He looks like himself again," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Like he's just sleeping." I smiled and nodded, but inside I was thinking about that breath, the warmth, the exhalation, and I wondered if Thomas had been trying to tell me something in those final moments before I sealed his mouth shut forever. After the service, I returned to the embalming room and stood at the table where I'd prepared him. I replayed the procedure in my mind, searching for any logical explanation. And then I remembered something. When I'd first received Thomas's body, his medical chart noted that he'd been on a ventilator for the final 3 days of his life. His lungs had been artificially inflated, kept breathing by machines, until the moment the ventilator was turned off. Could residual air have remained trapped in his lungs? Could the positioning of his body, the pressure of my hands during preparation, have released that air in a way that mimicked breathing? It was possible, barely, but it didn't explain the warmth. Dead bodies don't exhale warm breath. They cool rapidly, approaching room temperature within hours. And Thomas's body had been refrigerated. There was no warmth left, unless something else had been there. Something that used his lungs, his throat, his mouth to push out one final breath. One last attempt to communicate before I sutured his lips closed and silenced him forever. I've prepared dozens of bodies since Thomas Harlow. I follow the same procedures, the same techniques. But now, every time I lean in close to suture a mouth, I pause. I listen. I feel for any hint of warmth, any whisper of movement. Because I know what I felt that day. I know that Thomas's body was cold, still, and clinically dead. But something had breathed warm air onto my cheek. Something had exhaled as I worked. And I've never been able to explain it. I still think about his wife standing by the casket, talking to him, whispering things I couldn't hear. And I wonder if she felt it too. That presence, that warmth, the sense that even though he was gone, some part of him was still there, listening, trying to respond. I closed his mouth that day. I sealed his lips with wire and thread. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd silenced something that was trying to speak. And sometimes, late at night when the funeral home is quiet, I think about all the bodies I've prepared, all the mouths I've sutured closed, and I wonder how many of them were trying to tell me something before I took away their last chance to breathe. The chapel bells haven't worked in decades, but someone is ringing them. My name is Chen, and I've been the cemetery manager at Willowbrook Memorial for 17 years. I oversee operations for 63 acres, including the old chapel that sits at the center of the property. The chapel was built in 1892 and served as the main gathering place for funeral services until the new facility was constructed in 1978. After that, the old chapel fell into disuse, and by the time I started working here, it had been closed for decades. The bell tower, specifically, had been inactive since 1971. The original rope had rotted through, and the bells, 3 bronze bells of varying sizes, were left to rust in place. I'd inspected them myself years ago. The ropes were gone, the mechanisms were seized with corrosion, and the bells themselves were immovable. The tower was locked, and no one had accessed it in over 40 years. Which is why, when I started hearing bells ringing at dusk, I knew something was wrong. It started in late August. I was finishing my evening rounds, checking the grounds before locking up for the night, when I heard it, 3 clear chimes, resonant and deep, echoing across the cemetery. They came from the direction of the old chapel. I stopped walking and listened. The sound faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. I walked toward the chapel, trying to pinpoint the source, but by the time I arrived, everything was silent. The chapel doors were locked, just as they'd been for years. The windows were boarded up. I circled the building, checking for any signs of intrusion, and found nothing. I even climbed the narrow staircase to the bell tower entrance. The door was locked, the padlock rusted but intact. I assumed it had been my imagination, maybe sound carrying from a nearby church, or wind creating an acoustic illusion. I noted it in my log and went home. The next evening, I heard them again, same time just before dusk. 3 chimes, slow and measured, coming unmistakably from the chapel bell tower. This time, I was prepared. I grabbed my keys and ran to the chapel, unlocking the main door and rushing inside. The interior was dark, musty, and filled with the smell of old wood and decay. I turned on my flashlight and made my way to the bell tower staircase. The door at the top was still locked. I fumbled with my keys, found the right one, and pushed the door open. The bell tower was exactly as I remembered it. 3 bronze bells hung from a wooden frame, their surfaces covered in rust and bird droppings. The original ropes were long gone, reduced to brittle fragments hanging from the ceiling. There was no mechanism, no way to ring the bells. They were frozen in place, immovable. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I noticed something. The air in the tower was warm. Not just warm hot, as if someone had been there recently, generating heat. And when I looked closely at the bells, I saw something that made my skin crawl. The smallest bell, the one closest to me, was swaying, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving. The motion was dying down, as if it had been ringing moments before I arrived. I reached out and touched it. The bronze was warm beneath my fingers. Not hot, but distinctly warmer than it should have been in the cold, abandoned tower. I looked down at the floor and saw the remains of the old rope, brittle, rotted threads scattered across the boards. And lying among them, coiled carefully as if someone had just set it down, was a section of rope. New rope. Fresh, fibrous, and warm to the touch. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The rope was maybe 10 feet long, frayed at both ends, and it was still warm, not just ambient warmth, but active heat, as if it had been gripped by human hands minutes before. I looked up at the bells. They were still now, silent and motionless. But someone had been here. Someone had rung them, and they'd left this rope behind. I locked the tower and returned to my office. I checked the security logs. No one had signed in. No vehicles had entered through the main gate. I reviewed the chapel's history, searching for any explanation. The bells had been silent for over 50 years. The mechanisms were rusted beyond use. There was no logical reason they should be ringing. But over the next 2 weeks, they rang every evening at dusk. 3 chimes. Always 3. Always at the same time. And every time I ran to the tower, I found the same thing: the bells motionless, the air warm, and the rope lying on the floor, still radiating heat. I started arriving at the chapel 30 minutes before dusk and positioning myself inside the tower. I sat on the dusty floor, flashlight in hand, waiting for the bells to ring. But they never did. Not when I was watching. Only when I was outside, when I was distracted, when I wasn't looking directly at them. In September, I brought a colleague, David, one of the groundskeepers, to witness it. We stood outside the chapel at dusk and waited. Right on schedule, the bells rang. 3 clear chimes. David looked at me, his face pale. How is that possible? We ran inside together and climbed to the tower. The bells were still. The rope was on the floor, warm and fresh. David reached out and touched one of the bells. "This is impossible," he whispered. We installed a motion sensor camera in the tower the next day. It was aimed directly at the bells, programmed to record any movement. For 3 days, the bells were silent. And then, on the 4th day, they rang again. I reviewed the footage immediately. The camera had recorded for 6 hours, from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m., covering the time when the bells typically rang. I watched the entire recording, frame by frame. At 7:32 p.m., exactly when I'd heard the chimes, the bells didn't move. They remained perfectly still. No swaying, no ringing, no visible mechanism. But the audio captured it clearly: 3 resonant chimes, echoing through the tower, as if the bells were being rung by an invisible hand. And then, at 7:33 p.m., 1 minute after the chiming stopped, something appeared in the frame: the rope. It materialized on the floor, coiling itself into place, as if someone had just set it down. But there was no one there. No hands, no figure, just the rope, appearing out of nothing. I watched the footage a dozen times, trying to find an explanation, a glitch, a trick of light, anything. But the recording was clear. The rope had appeared from nowhere, still swinging slightly, still radiating warmth. I called a specialist, a professor of acoustics from the local university, and asked him to examine the bells. He spent an afternoon in the tower, testing the bells, measuring the acoustics, analyzing the mechanisms. His conclusion was definitive. These bells haven't been rung in decades. The mechanisms are completely seized. There's no way they could produce sound. "But I've heard them," I said. "Multiple people have heard them." He looked at me thoughtfully. "Sound can be strange. It can carry from unexpected sources, echo in unusual ways. But these bells? They're physically incapable of ringing." After he left, I sat in the tower alone, staring at the bells. I thought about the rope, how it appeared fresh each time, how it radiated warmth, how it coiled on the floor, as if someone had just released it. And I realized something. The rope wasn't new. It was the original rope, or a memory of it. The same rope that had hung in this tower for 100 years before it rotted away. Somehow, at dusk, when the light was fading and the cemetery was quiet, that rope returned, and something, was using it to ring the bells. I stopped trying to explain it. I just accepted it. Every evening at dusk, the bells ring, 3 chimes, slow and measured. And when I climb to the tower, I find the rope lying on the floor, warm and real, as if someone had just finished their work and walked away. I don't know who's ringing them. A ghost? A memory? Some echo of the past that replays itself every evening when the light fades? I don't have answers. All I know is that the bells ring, the rope appears, and somewhere in that tower, someone is still performing their duty, calling the faithful, marking the passage of time. I've stopped investigating. I've stopped bringing people to witness it. Because some things, I've learned, don't need to be explained. They just need to be acknowledged. So every evening at dusk, when I hear those 3 chimes echoing across the cemetery, I pause. I listen. And I remember that even in places meant for the dead, some routines never end. Some bells keep ringing. And some hands, though long since turned to dust, still reach for the rope and pull, filling the air with sound, marking the hours, calling to no one and everyone, reminding us that even in silence, the past is never truly still. She was standing at the casket on the monitor, but the room was empty. My name is Director Ortega, and I've been managing Heritage Funeral Home for 24 years. I've overseen thousands of services, coordinated with countless families, and developed systems to ensure that every detail is handled with care and precision. I pride myself on professionalism, on creating a space where families can grieve without worry. But what happened last November has shaken that confidence. It's made me question what I see, what I know, and what might be watching when I think I'm alone. The service was for Eleanor Vasquez, 83, who died peacefully in her sleep. Her memorial was held on a Friday evening, attended by family and close friends. It was a simple service, prayers, eulogies, soft music, and by 8:30 p.m., everyone had left, except Eleanor's granddaughter, Maria, who asked for a few private moments. I told her to take all the time she needed and stepped out to give her privacy. I went to my office down the hall and began finalizing paperwork for the weekend services. Our funeral home has security monitors in every room, and I glanced at the screen showing the main viewing room where Eleanor's casket was positioned. Maria was standing at the casket, her hand resting on her grandmother's folded hands, crying quietly. I looked away, giving her privacy even through the camera. 10 minutes later, I checked the monitor again. Maria was gone. The viewing room appeared empty, the casket still open, flowers arranged around it, soft lighting casting gentle shadows. I assumed she'd left through the side exit and locked up, without saying goodbye, understandable given her grief. I finished my paperwork and began my evening walkthrough, checking each room before locking the building for the night. When I reached the viewing room, I opened the door and immediately knew something was wrong. The room was empty, just as the monitor had shown. The casket was still open, but the air felt different, heavier, colder, as if someone had just left. I walked to the casket to close the lid and noticed something on the floor beside it. A tissue, crumpled and damp, as if Maria had dropped it while crying. I picked it up and turned to leave. That's when I saw the security monitor on the wall. We have a small screen in each viewing room, so staff can check other areas of the building without leaving. The screen showed the main viewing room, my viewing room, the room I was standing in. And on the screen, standing at Eleanor's casket, was a woman. I spun around. The room was empty. I looked back at the screen. The woman was still there, leaning over the casket, her face close to Eleanor's, as if whispering something. She was wearing a dark dress, her hair pulled back, and her posture was familiar: grief, intimacy, the bearing of someone saying a final goodbye. But the room behind me was empty. I could see the casket. I could see the entire space. There was no one there. I walked closer to the monitor, my heart pounding. The woman on the screen turned slightly, and I saw her profile. It wasn't Maria. This woman was older, maybe in her 60s, with a face I didn't recognize. She leaned down further, her lips moving, and placed her hand on Eleanor's chest. I turned to look at the casket again. Empty. No one standing there. Eleanor's body lay undisturbed, hands folded, face peaceful. But on the monitor, the woman was still there, still speaking, still touching. I ran out of the room and down the hall to my office, where the main security console displayed feeds from all cameras. I pulled up the viewing room feed on the large screen. The woman was still visible, standing at the casket, her head bowed now as if in prayer. I rewound the footage. I found the moment Maria had left 8:45 p.m., exiting through the side door, exactly as I'd thought. The room was empty for 3 minutes. And then, at 8:48 p.m., the woman appeared. Not walked in, not entered through a door. She simply appeared, standing at the casket, as if she'd materialized from nothing. I watched the footage in real time. The woman stood there for another 2 minutes, her lips moving continuously, her hand resting on Eleanor's chest. And then, at 8:56 p.m., she straightened up, looked directly at the camera, and faded. Not walked away, not left. She became translucent, pixel by pixel, her image dissolving until only the empty room remained. I sat in my office, staring at the screen, my hands shaking. I rewound the footage and watched it again and again. The woman appeared, stood at the casket, whispered something, looked at the camera, and disappeared. I saved the file, locked my office, and returned to the viewing room. I stood exactly where the woman had been standing and looked down at Eleanor. Everything appeared normal. But when I leaned closer, I noticed something. Eleanor's right hand, which had been folded over her left, had shifted. The fingers were now slightly spread, as if someone had moved them. I checked the monitor. On the screen, Eleanor's hands were in their original position, left over right, fingers folded. But in the room, standing right next to the casket, I could see that the right hand had definitely moved. The image on the camera didn't match reality. I closed the casket immediately, locked the viewing room, and called my assistant director, Linda. She arrived within 20 minutes, and I showed her the footage. We watched it together 3 times. Linda went pale. "Who is she?" "I don't know." "What was she saying?" I shook my head. I couldn't hear anything, just saw her lips moving. Linda suggested we contact the family, see if they recognize the woman in the footage. We called Maria and asked if she could return to the funeral home to help us with a security matter. She arrived 30 minutes later, her eyes red from crying. I showed her the footage. Maria watched in silence, her face growing paler with each passing second. When the woman faded from the screen, Maria whispered, "That's my great-aunt, Catherine." "Is she still alive?" I asked carefully. Maria shook her head. "She died 3 years ago. She was my grandmother's sister. They were very close." Linda and I exchanged glances. "Did she have a message she wanted to share with your grandmother?" I asked. Maria thought for a moment. "When Aunt Catherine was dying, she made my grandmother promise something. She asked her to tell her one last time that she forgave her for something that happened when they were young. I don't know the details, but my grandmother never got to say it. Catherine died before Grandma could visit." We stood in silence, processing this. Finally, Linda said, "Do you think that's what she was saying in the footage?" Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I think she came to say it herself, to tell Grandma that everything was okay." We gave Maria the footage file, and she thanked us. After she left, Linda and I returned to the viewing room. We stood at the casket now closed, and I thought about what I'd seen. A woman who'd been dead for 3 years, appearing on camera but not in the room, whispering something to her sister, and then fading away. I've reviewed that footage dozens of times since then. I've shown it to colleagues, to technical experts, to anyone who might offer an explanation. The consensus is always the same. There's no rational explanation. The woman appeared from nowhere, interacted with a body in a sealed casket, and vanished. But here's what haunts me most. When I rewind to the moment she looks at the camera, just before she fades, I can see her expression clearly. It's not grief. It's not sadness. It's relief. As if she'd been waiting for years to deliver that message, and finally in that moment, she'd found peace. Eleanor Vasquez was buried the next day. Her family requested a closed casket, and the service proceeded without incident. But I think about that footage constantly. I think about Catherine standing at the casket, whispering words of forgiveness to her sister, and then looking at me through the camera, as if to say, "I'm done now. I can go." I still manage Heritage Funeral Home. I still oversee services, coordinate with families, and maintain our security systems. But now, every time I check the monitors, I look carefully. I watch for figures that shouldn't be there, for visitors who appear without entering, for moments when the camera shows something the eye cannot see. Because I know what I witnessed. I saw a woman who'd been dead for 3 years return to speak to her sister. And when I locked up that night, when I closed Eleanor's casket and dimmed the lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd witnessed something sacred. A final goodbye. A message delivered across the boundary between life and death. And a reminder that sometimes love is strong enough to bring us back, even when we're gone. The footage is still on my computer. I keep it locked in a password-protected file. And sometimes, late at night when the funeral home is quiet, I play it back. I watch Catherine appear, lean close to her sister, whisper words I'll never hear, and then fade into nothing. And I wonder how many others have come to say goodbye, how many visitors I've missed, how many whispered conversations happen in our viewing rooms when the cameras are off and the living have gone home. The dead, I've learned, don't always stay silent. Sometimes they return. Sometimes they stand at caskets and deliver messages no one else can hear. And sometimes, if you're watching the right monitor at the right moment, you'll see them fade away, pixel by pixel, until only their love remains.